In the summer, I suggested to Imre that we hit the UK. I was already planning to visit him in Normandy again, and I figured it was just a quick hop across the channel to get to London, a city we both love. I had a few friends there. For Imre, it held almost mythological proportions on account of his lifelong obsession with British rock, the Beatles and the Stones, of course, but perhaps even more importantly, the Kinks. You can hear traces of Ray Davies through many of his songs. He also really digs early Donovan. So, anyway, my thoughts were fairly straightforward. Pop up to Paris and take the Eurostar to London for a couple of days, hoping to score a little gig at some pub. But Imre came up with a better plan. Drive up to Dieppe on the coast of Normandy, and then take the ferry to Brighton, where we could crash for a night or two before heading to London. I wrote my UK friends and asked for possible venues. Matthew Fink, who's a poet, wrote back suggesting a place called the George Tavern. He said something about how some other friends of his had performed there under mysterious circumstances, a story too long to explain. Matthew's emails already tend to have an air of mystery, or at least fancy, because he signs them Matteo, and they're always in pentameter, or at least have some other formal, usually metrical constraint and odd line breaks. I tend to answer in kind, just because. The George was allegedly one of the oldest pubs in London, and for some reason struck Matteo as suitable for our act. When I looked the place up, there was an amazing photo of Grace Jones, which of course made me think that indeed the George Tavern was suitable for our act, but I wondered if they'd feel the same about us. There was another photo on the website of Kate Moss wearing a George Tavern t-shirt. More Googling led to the legendary claim that Chaucer had been known to tie one on there in the 14th century. Dickens mentions the place in Little Dorrit, one of my favorite novels. I wasn't sure whom to be most excited about, Chaucer, Dickens, Grace Jones, or Kate Moss, but I thought that foursome might just be our target audience. Believe it or not, when I wrote the George Tavern, they agreed to put us on the bill. Then I began scouting locations in Brighton. Hands down, the weirdest establishment seemed to be Bom-Bane's, run by a chanteuse about midway between Imre's age and my own. She apparently performed her original repertoire with some sort of fishbowl balanced on her head. She also readily agreed to take us in. We booked our ferry tickets and Fleabag lodgings and got to work hammering out our set. For the London show, we thought we'd invite a drummer to sit in, Gary, another guy of roughly our generation that we'd found through the music he posted online. Most of his archive, in fact, consisted not of his own playing, but rather of old recordings of his brother, Brian, who had passed away fairly recently, under what circumstances we didn't know. What we did know was that Brian, like Imre, was the kind of artist that made you scratch your head and wonder why the hell you'd never heard of him before. Nearly all of his songs had the ring of classics. I'd done covers of a couple of them, and Imre had made a French version of another. We were in agreement that the guy was an astonishment. Gary, for his part, was pretty self-effacing, only modestly admitting his musicianship on some tracks, though he sounded very capable and personally like a prince of a guy. When we invited him to join us for the gig, he accepted. We set out on a blustery July morning to Dieppe. The Normandy coast can get pretty warm in the summer, but the last couple of weeks had been more like a typical April. Cool winds and scattered showers. Imre warned me that Brighton was likely to be chillier still. The channel crossing started out smoothly enough. That is, the water was a bit choppy, but nothing to write home about. We stood on the upper deck as we sailed out of Dieppe. Imre was staring back at the cliffs of Varengeville, and he had that Viking look he sometimes gets. Inside, it was pretty comfortable. There were padded chairs and little coffee tables scattered around, and they were populated by a mix of young families and older couples. It struck us that many people were involved in activities that required no electronic apparatus at all. Reading paperbacks, writing in notebooks, knitting, and doing crossword puzzles. I'd brought some knitting myself. Imre always has a notebook. We reasoned that anybody who'd crossed the channel on a boat, A, had some time on his or her hands, and B, had a certain taste for doing things the old-fashioned way. The ferry seems a bit antiquated, but from what we could see it was perfectly civilized and reasonably efficient. 3 hours crossing from Dieppe to Brighton. Well, that was the scheduled travel time anyway. But shortly after we'd settled into our comfy seats, a woman announced over a loudspeaker, first in French and then in English, that any trained medical workers were urgently needed for a passenger in distress. We noticed a couple of people jumping up to help. A low-grade anxiety settled over us all and held for an hour or so until another announcement came on saying that due to this passenger's dire condition, she would need to be evacuated by helicopter. So we were going to have to hold still for a little while until that could happen. This would affect our arrival time, but they couldn't yet tell us by how much. Actually, they didn't identify the passenger as female, but we happened to be sitting near one of the British nurses who had offered her services, and we overheard her explaining that a woman appeared to be having a heart attack. She seemed to think she'd be okay, but evidently it was better for her to be flown back to France than to wait to be hospitalized in Britain. The ferry stopped moving. We could feel the engines running, but we were just sitting still there, apparently right smack in the middle of the channel. It was a very strange sensation. It felt as if time itself were suspended. We never actually heard the helicopter landing on the top deck. So I can't really tell you how long we were sitting there in a daze like that, but when they finally updated us on the implications for our arrival time, they said we'd be about 3 hours late. Yikes. We'd given ourselves not much wiggle room in advance of our gig in Brighton. Now it appeared we'd be getting to shore just minutes before showtime. We'd still need to get a bus from the port of New Haven to the town proper and then drop our things off at the hotel. Both Imre and I had a very tenuous cellular connection on the boat, so we each sent a message to Jane, the proprietress of Bom-Bane's, explaining our plight. We didn't actually think she'd be too upset. When we'd written her the day before saying we were looking forward to meeting her, she wrote back warning us that nobody had booked anything for the evening, so she wasn't sure there would be any audience at all. She said it nicely. Our feelings weren't particularly hurt. We hadn't exactly papered the town with publicity, and who the hell knew who we were in Brighton anyway? But once we'd docked, things moved pretty quickly. We hopped on a bus and checked into our hotel. We texted Jane to say that we'd pop over as soon as we could, just to say hello, and if it made any sense, maybe we could still play a tune or two, and if not, no problem. But as we were unloading our stuff in our room, Imre started to waffle even on that plan. He said the prolonged boat ride had left him a little wobbly. He thought maybe we could just drop it. I did something I rarely do. I mildly guilt-tripped him. Good call. Bom-Bane's was a magical little terrarium of a place, and Jane was altogether as quirky as she'd appeared on the internet. Her place was tiny, but full up with cheery patrons drinking and dining. There were peculiar paintings on the walls and the aforementioned fishbowl-like assemblages that revealed themselves on further inspection to be elaborate headgear. Jane later explained to us that she liked to make fanciful hats and often used them as thematic illustrations for her compositions. She offered us a drink and invited us to take a seat in the corner and play. She said, "Here's the musical act that was delayed." We jumped into our set. Despite his initial resistance, Imre was cheered by the warm applause, and pretty soon we were on a roll. At one point, a table of 3 middle-aged hens, as they call ladies in the UK, started to giggle. I thought perhaps it was Imre's slightly dirty lyrics, but between songs they pointed out that the table at which we were seated seemed to be having a reaction to our playing, moving slowly but perceptibly up and down. This was evidently a little motor-controlled trick of Jane's. There was another table with a clockwork-like operation under the glass moving around small plastic sea creatures. After our set, we chit-chatted with the patrons and checked out a lengthy framed, sad but true poem of Jane's on the wall, which had been illustrated with those peculiar paintings. It was the troubling story of a young girl who had, with her sister, made a stuffed toy man named Guy. Unfortunately, her mother found him somehow objectionable and threw him into the fire. Guy was incinerated. Jane said that the little girl grew up to have serial difficulties in love, often precipitating the ends of relationships before they were really over. She said that psychotherapists had had various hypotheses for the reasons for her problems, but that she knew that it all stemmed from the incineration of her beloved Guy. Later we looked at some old pictures of Jane online and listened to some of her songs. One was called I've Lost My Sheen. Jane had been a very beautiful young woman. In fact, she still was. We found her songs enchanting. She said she liked ours too. The next day we explored Brighton. Imre had spent a few days there years ago on a holiday with his younger son, and he had fond memories. It really is delightful. We explored the pier, which is a bit like Coney Island, and took a ride on the Ferris wheel. We also visited the Royal Pavilion, which was once a vacation resort of the royals. The architecture is in the Indian style, which is weird if you think about it. There were lots of Britons taking pictures of themselves in front of the pavilion. Actually, I took a picture of Imre, too, but watching that spectacle of self-documentation before the remnants of England's colonial past, Imre knit his brow and said, La nostalgie. It was perhaps a little judgmental as an observation regarding the Britons' attitude toward the period of empire, but Imre was the first to admit to his own nostalgic tendencies in the UK, which really came to the fore when we got to London. This had to do with his own regular pilgrimages there in his youth. It had been nearly 20 years since his last visit, but in his teens and early 20s he went there all the time to see shows and buy records. The thing is, his obsession with British rock of the 60s and 70s is by no means singular. That's the music that seemed to be playing everywhere we went. We walked past a little gaggle of drunk young men outside a pub, and they were singing A Hard Day's Night. Oh, I forgot to mention that the little inn we stayed at in Brighton was called Strawberry Fields. I should say a bit more about our preparation for the London gig. My friends in London had been, as I said, very helpful with the suggestion of a venue, but sadly they'd be out of town on the day of our gig. Matthew wrote to apologize. He and his partner, PA, had decamped to Coupy in Tuscany, where, he reported in hexameter, the furnace-like heat has annihilated the ambition to move. He advised us to fill the George with as many of our partisans as possible, since the greatest drawback of performing in a pub is that the customers tend to be really blotto. I wrote back in my habitual, if paltry, 5 metrical feet, I'm sorry, too, you won't be at the gig, but we will raise a glass to you and P.A. Our friends are all impressed as hell that we'll be playing at a bar where Chaucer purportedly got sauced. Our warm regards. We ate a jellied pig's foot in the garden. That was true. Imre had just been introducing me to some local Norman specialties that day. Believe it or not, the pied de cochon gelé was the easiest to get down. There was also museau, which is snout, and a liqueur called Jet 27, which looked and tasted like scope. Seriously, that was the worst. Anyway, it appeared that our partisans would consist of Gary's family. Another brother, Terry, and his wife, Jo, were giving us a ride over, and a sister, Jane, and some nieces met us at the club. They were really lovely and very warm. That may give you the impression of a lot of family solidarity, and indeed, they seem to be extremely close-knit. Part of this solidarity expresses itself around the loss of Brian. Before we went on, Gary gestured to his wristwatch and said, This was Bry's watch. I always wear it when I play. And they all nodded wistfully. Terry said, That's how he keeps time. Jane said, And the glasses. Gary pulled out a pair of John Lennon-style shades that had also belonged to Brian. But I think they were also coming out that night for Gary. It was something of a big deal for him to be playing out. It had been about 15 years. He said he had some social anxieties. Imre empathized. I asked Gary if he knew Imre's song, I Hate Parties. He said, I love that one. As I mentioned, Gary's close in age to Imre, and he shares much of his musical taste as well. He also loves the Kinks, and he told us he met them once back in the day. He said, It's too bad they couldn't get along, Ray and Dave. The Davies brothers. It's true, everybody says that. They used to famously fight on stage, and in interviews they were constantly either bashing or bemoaning each other. Unlike, obviously, Gary, whose fraternal devotion appeared to be a central anchor of his existence. Imre said he'd seen a documentary clip in which Ray Davies said that when he was sick in the hospital for months, all he could think about was how much he wanted his brother to visit him. Finally, he did. Still, when I checked online about the Davies brothers' feud, there were some pretty choice recent quotations from Dave about his brother Ray. "You've heard of vampires? Well, Ray sucks me dry of ideas, emotions, and creativity. It's toxic for me to be with him. He's a control freak. We must be careful. We might be feeding Ray's illness by making him think he's more interesting than he is." When asked to identify Ray's illness, he said, "He's a narcissist. I think Ray has only been happy for 3 years in his life, and those were the 3 years before I was born." But someplace else he said, "I love my brother." Well, how did our gig go? It was sweet. There were a couple of other acts. A French girl who seemed to be of possibly Malagasy descent who'd also brought out her whole family. She sang country songs in English. A young British woman of Caribbean descent with a striking voice and a hammer technique on guitar. A very young British rocker guy who laughed somewhat hysterically between his mournful, howling songs. And us, the oddball elders. I introduced us, making reference to our own diverse points of origin, and we crooned, plucked, and shuffled our way through the set. The crowd, which, let's face it, was basically constituted by 2 large and supportive families, didn't seem particularly blotto. We stuck around for a bit until Imre's own mild social phobia set in, and we hugged everybody and headed back to our hotel. The next day we went to see the Turner collection at the Tate. Imre and I both love Turner. If you stand back from the paintings, you get entirely lost in the landscapes. You feel sucked into them, but if you look more closely, you see they're actually very weird and apparently haphazard blobs of oil. They don't look painted at all, but like somebody made a mess. How did he do that? Imre, as I've said, has a mystical relationship to nature, so that getting lost experience is quite profound for him. When we felt really saturated with Turner, we went into the Blake Gallery. They were contemporaries, of course, and both visionaries, but so radically different in their originality, it's hard to believe they were living in the same time and place. The wall text said that Blake's highly innovative engravings were inspired by his recently deceased brother. I stared and stared at those and thought about Gary and Brian and Ray and Dave Davies. The next day we went back to Brighton to catch our ferry back to Normandy. The station was very chaotic, and they told us to get on without standing in line to pick up our tickets, as they were just rushing people through on account of the crowds. We were confused until we got off at Brighton and realized that we'd landed smack dab in the middle of their enormous annual gay pride celebration. Brighton had already struck us as pretty queer, and now it was jam-packed with rainbow-bedecked revelers. We wriggled our way through the crowds down to the stony beach, which was strewn with colorful lesbians and pink-haired boys in suspenders. The sun was finally shining, brilliantly. We sat on the stones and combed our hands through them. I found some beautiful white shells, polished down to the shapes of tiny ears. They reminded me of a friend's baby, the one I'd been knitting booties for on the boat. The baby's name is Leonora, and she has small, lovely ears that look just like those shells. It was time to go, so we walked back to Churchill Square to catch our bus to the ferry. The bus system was also in a state of mayhem, but somehow we managed to sardine ourselves into one and make it back to the New Haven port in the nick of time. For all the melancholy thinking about the past on this trip, somehow those colorful young people in Brighton and those tiny ear-shaped shells had pointed us to something that felt sweetly like the future. This time, the waters were utterly peaceful. We stood on the deck at the stern and watched the sun setting behind us. There was something profoundly right this time about looking back, but also feeling ourselves moving forward.
And we know I'm not the ones who make this world go round. Her name is Jane bom-bane. And we never make it to the Hall of Fame. Are you ready to go?